Uvlulotak uvanga kazulana siknasog miungurunga kuvesuktunga monga kama. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Barb Amarok and I'm from Nome and work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus. I'm very excited and honored to be a part of this series and assisting as facilitator today. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that this event is being recorded for those who are unable to attend. I start by acknowledging that those at our Trothyeta campus in Fairbanks are on the unceded customary lands of the Dene people of the Tanana River. In Nome, we are on Inupiaq, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands, and we honor the continued fight for the rights of First Peoples and stand together in solidarity and action. At UAF, we are growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series titled Shine a Light, Promoting Conversations on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us in thinking critically about our worldviews. The series is led by the Northwest Campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. We thank the UAF Department of Equity and Compliance and the UAF Nanook Diversity and Action Center for teaming up with the Northwest Campus to bring this series to reality. We've hosted several relevant topics through this series, such as Black History in Alaska and Women's History with a focus on Alaska Native women. You can find the recordings on our website, nwc.uaf.edu under the Courses tab. This semester, we've moved our Shine a Light events to the noon hour of each third Tuesday of the month, and we hope you continue to join us. I'm very excited about today's discussion with Dr. Charlene Stern, titled Lifting the Veil, Colonization, Critical Consciousness, and Community Development in Rural Alaska. Dr. Stern serves as the UAF Vice Chancellor for Rural Community and Native Education, and she has taught for the UAF Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development since 2014. Education plays a critical role in the development of both our individual and our collective consciousness. It can either serve to broaden or to narrow our awareness of the world. This presentation examines the interplay between colonization, critical consciousness, and community development in rural Alaska. We hope you join us each month as we explore and inform various topics. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that Dr. Stern may address at the end of her presentation. You're more than welcome to use the chat feature, but please funnel any questions you may have through the Q&A feature. Please welcome Dr. Charlene Stern.
Masicho, Dr. Amarok, and welcome everybody to today's presentation. I have to say I was really honored to be asked to be part of the Shine a Light speaker series. Shine a Light has, in the few months that it's really been implemented, has made an enormous contribution already in terms of elevating topics, conversations, and dialogue around issues that are extremely important, both to society, but also to UAF's efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you. We can go ahead and change the slide. So I appreciated the fact that Dr. Amarok began with a land acknowledgement, and so I'd like to also offer my own. I acknowledge that I'm working on Trothyeta, a place of distinct importance to the Lower Tanana and Dene people. Their stewardship of the land over thousands of years makes my work at UAF possible. Such land acknowledgements are really important because they recognize the long history of these places prior to how we know them today. It acknowledges that Indigenous peoples have always been and will always be in relationship to the land and the institutions that are now part of that landscape. Recently, I know many students, faculty, and staff have contacted UAF, different offices, my own included, to ask about how to incorporate land acknowledgements into maybe their presentations, their syllabi, their email signatures. I wanted to share that my office is currently working on developing a short video which talks about land acknowledgements, what they are, why they're important, and different ideas for how we can incorporate them into our work at UAF. So wanted to put out that announcement, and we can go ahead and change slides. One thing that I think is important for many folks within the UAF community to know is that in Indigenous cultures, it's very customary to introduce yourself, not just as an individual, but really in relationship to your family and the place you're from. So I included a traditional introduction from my community area, the Gwich'in region of Alaska, and how it would read is Shalak Nai, Shijeh Nai, Shojri, Charlene Sternoji. Shitsu Maggie, Dinjijuk Shojri Ichsai, Haiju Shahnya, Vashraik Ogwatsan Ichli, Shiahan Nai, Peter Stern, Zat Florence Newman, Gavojri, Shitsi Tsa Shitsuha James Maggie Gilbert Gavojri, Berkeley, California, Chun, Shitsi Alfred Zat Shitsu Barbara Gavojri, Shiju Chun Grayson Oji, Dinjijuk Ditsi Yeti Oji. So you can see what that translates to, and there's a lot of different, versions and different iterations of these traditional introductions. But I always feel like it's really important because, the first thing when you go to any community in rural Alaska and they recognize you being from another place, often they'll ask you, who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Where are you from? And this is really what they're getting to. Because we are extensions of those that came before us, and it's just part of how we relate to one another. So that's really important to think about when we're talking about sort of greeting each other, building relationships where we really are just kind of beyond, hello, my name is kind of thing. So we can go ahead and change slides. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about where I'm from. I mentioned that I'm from Vashraiko in my introduction, and Vashraiko is our traditional name for our community, which is known in English as Arctic Village. And Vashraiko in our language refers to our place as a creek along a steep bank. And so this is a creek that kind of runs through our community, and it's actually a large reason of why our community exists where it is today. And so this is a creek that we still fish from, and it's long served as a fishing spot for us. And so, I wanted to share with you a little bit about this place that has played such an important role in defining kind of who I am and what grounds me in my own identity. And Arctic Village, as you can see on the map, is located in northeastern Alaska interior. And it is just on the southern foothills of the Brooks Range. So it's a beautiful, beautiful place. We can go ahead and change slides. So one of the premises that I like to start off any talks that I do in relation to community development with is the premise that Alaska Native peoples have been practicing planning and community building for thousands of years. As I became a student in community planning and development, one of the first things I was presented with was a mainstream textbook that talked about city building traditions and how they evolved in the United States, as though those were the only origins of community development. It really took applying kind of a critical lens, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later, to understand that if we expand our definition for what community development is, what community planning is, what community building is, then it actually makes room for all of these other knowledge systems that have those intact practices and frameworks and methodologies. And so as I started doing my own kind of research and growing my understanding about planning and community development, I realized, wow, we sit on thousands of years of history, knowledge, and wisdom and practice of what planning community development looks like in our communities. And one of the things that I learned through this is that our planning horizons were both short, midterm, and long-term. So our people learn to plan, not just from day to day, but literally from season to season and even generation to generation. If our ancestors weren't thinking about us as they were making decisions in regards to education, resource use, stewardship, all of those things, you know, we wouldn't be here today. And so I feel like just our presence alone is testimony to the fact that our people are really good planners, and it's part of our traditions. We can go ahead and skip to the next slide. So one of the things that I think is really also important is we look at the characteristics of our own planning models, because we're a very diverse state. We live in all sorts of different landscapes. We have different cultures, different language groups. One thing though that I've realized as I've taught some of this in my classes, and I've explored it myself and worked with elders on documenting some of our planning knowledge, is that by and large, one of the common characteristics is that our planning models were seasonal. So as our people were experiencing fall, we were not just undertaking activities for that season, but we were undertaking activities that would help us to get through winter, you know, to process and preserve food and build, you know, all of our firewood stores and all those sorts of things, which became really essential for us to endure those more difficult winter months. So we very much had kind of like a seasonal aspect to our traditional ways of life, and even to this day as well. The other thing I started realizing is that there was so much strategy involved in these traditional planning models that we did not have the luxury to waste time, waste resources, you know, all of these things, that everything we did had to be purposeful. And I was just presenting to a class last night, and I was talking about, it's one of the reasons why I don't use the term nomadic when I describe our traditional ways of life that were really based on a lot more movement than now, in terms of being settled communities, that our people traveled from place to place, and they did so strategically. They always knew where the best places to fish were going to be at that particular time. They always knew where the best places to hunt were going to be. They always knew when the berries were going to, you know, when it was going to be a good year. So we weren't just kind of wandering aimlessly. Everything had a strategy, and everything had kind of a time and a purpose. We also were highly disciplined as we undertook this lifestyle. As I mentioned, you know, people worked very hard to survive in some of the conditions that our ancestors endured. And there was a lot of physical training, a lot of mental training, a lot of kind of inherent wellness that was built in, so that we could keep focused on the things that were really important to perpetuate our people from one generation to the next. All of that required discipline. I included this quote here, and it comes from a document that my tribe produced. And I really think it kind of speaks to why it's important for us to really feel empowered, and to recognize that our ancestors were very strategic and were very disciplined and were some of the best planners out there. And the quote is that we are the best people to make decisions for the tribal good because we have the most at stake. And that's really a principle in community development as well, that it's really the people that are most impacted that really should be at the table, right? That should be dictating some of the decisions about the future and that sort of thing. So I thought that that was a good quote to include. We could go ahead and change slides. So if any of you have ever taken a class with me or listened to my lectures, one of the things that I try to hit home in terms of looking at our societies, our tribal societies here in Alaska and probably other places as well, is that we really had much more intact spheres of control and influence versus kind of what we see today. And that's not necessarily, you know, meant to be a judgment call. It's just often how it is. Before colonization, our people were able to exercise much higher degrees of control over the aspects of their life that, you know, they felt were really important. Whether it was governance or education or land use and resource use, our people within our traditional territories were really empowered to make a lot of those decisions. And then there were things that were kind of outside of our spheres of control, things like trade relationships, warfare, resource availability, that we couldn't directly control all of the outcomes of, but we could certainly influence them. Like we could influence, you know, who we traded with and when and for what. We could influence when we decided to go to war with our neighbors and when we didn't, right? Like those are some things that we were able to influence. And then there were things that were sort of outside of our spheres of control and influence, like the weather, the climate, natural disasters, things like that, that we were just responding to, and that our life ways were really adapted to be able to have higher resilience towards some of those. I mention these because I think it's really important. With some of my students, I sort of have them map out what these spheres look like for them, what they imagine them to be prior to colonization. And then we map out kind of in a post-colonial context, what does this look like? What are the things that are within or outside of our spheres of control and influence? And more times than not, the diagrams look completely different. I'll often see students saying, gosh, our education systems really feel like they're kind of outside of our control. We may be able to influence them, but it's not like, you know, what we imagine our traditional education systems really being, right? Where we had sort of total control over those systems and what was taught and how it was taught and how students learned and all of those things. So it becomes a really important model, because ultimately then you can, it's like a snapshot assessment, where you can say, okay, these are the things that are really important to us. Here's sort of where they fall within these spheres. And if something is really critically important, and right now it's falling outside of where we need it to be, then that becomes part of our community development strategy, right? That we want to use the power and resources that we can and be intentional about sort of pulling that back in. So I wanted to just share this because it's a simple diagram, but it's really important in terms of what it communicates. And groups can use it to sort of build out their community development visioning. We can go to the next slide. So part of this presentation is designed to touch on colonization. And of course, with the lunch hour, we're not going to get into the detail that it deserves. But I did want to touch on a few things that have really happened that have changed the context, that have changed the planning and community development context that really have been influential, and it's really important for us to understand. So I have a friend, Bentham Ohia, who many of you may know. He's done a lot of work. He's Maori from Aotearoa, and he's done a lot of work in education and youth development and all kinds of really amazing aspects of their own development and community empowerment. And one of the quotes that I heard him say at a gathering was that colonization never sleeps. And I just thought that was a really powerful sort of way of understanding how colonization is not just a one-time event. It's not just contact. It really is this ever-present sort of dynamic that we deal with every single day, whether we recognize it or not. Let's go ahead and advance. So, we're not going to go into all of the history. I know Yvonne Peter, when he gave his Shine a Light presentation, he talked a lot more about the various forces of colonization in Alaska and how they've then become manifested in laws and policies, systems of education, all these sorts of things. But just wanting to show this kind of visual that really represents that colonization has come in many forms over time to Alaska. It's come in the form of government, it's come in the form of military, it's come in the form of religion, it's come in the form of development. It's really this layered system and systems that often sort of work together in tandem in different ways to really enforce kind of a particular set of, social, economic, political norms and an agenda that's very different than what was here in terms of Alaska Native societies. And so, the one takeaway, I guess, that I would encourage you all to think about is colonization did not just happen at contact. It did not happen at a particular date or period of time, that it really set the stage for the evolution of all of the systems that we currently experience in society, our political systems, our economic systems, our social systems, our cultural systems, all of those things, and all of the policies and programs and attitudes that generate those are all part of this kind of colonization process, right? So I think it's really important, and that's the main takeaway from this slide. We can advance. So one of the things that is very different, I think, in a post-colonial Alaska, right, is at one time you look at this map and you can see that the vast majority of these places, if not all of them, were stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And I wish I included a visual that Dr. Courtney Crothers created, which basically shows that in the history of any management system, whether it's fisheries or land, you know, you can see for thousands of years it was Indigenous stewardship. And for this little bit of time, it's been other forms of stewardship, whether it's state or federal or, you know, private. But really, we're talking about a small period where this map has looked very different, right? And so at one time, Alaska really was 100% probably utilized by Alaska Natives. Our ancestral territories were large, sometimes they overlapped, but this is a big land base. And you know, it's really important to recognize that over time, one of the outcomes of colonization and some of the land use management policies and laws that came into play have really fractionalized our ownership. And I know I hear a lot of people say, well, you know, Alaska Natives got to keep so much land, or we were afforded so much land as part of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. But really, if another way of looking at that is at one point we were 100% sort of stewards of the land, and now that has shrunk, right? Has shrunk to here you can see we're listed on this map as private owners. So that's a whole nother side of the history that we won't get into today. But what I wanted to share this with you is it's something to think about, but two, it also complicates community development even at a very local level. So we could switch to the next slide. So this is a community in my region, Fort Yukon, or Gwich'in, and this was a map produced by the ANCSA Corporation, the regional ANCSA Corporation of the Interior, Doyon. But what you can see, and some of the graphics aren't, or the charts aren't, descriptions aren't coming through, but basically the point in this visual is that there are multiple landowners even in some of our smaller remote communities. To the point where, you know, you often hear about how land was, there was allotments that happened in the lower 48, which really checkerboarded our traditional territories down there for tribes. The same checkerboarding in some ways is happening, but it's been through different mechanisms. Not to say that this is, you know, bad or good, but it just goes to show that now we have layers of landowners and managers, even at our most local level. And for community development purposes, that really matters. So we'll go ahead and change slides. So I wanted to just share kind of some perspective, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, that part of the ongoing legacy of colonialism is kind of represented in some of these and more. So one of them is the fact that now most Alaska Native peoples have settled into permanent year-round villages. We still do a lot of, you know, our subsistence. We still do a lot of our seasonal kind of ways of living, trapping, hunting, fishing, and those sorts of things. But now we pretty much have permanent settlements. And so that's a really significant change that's happened really in the last 100 years or more. So our historical timeline is also very different than other places like the lower 48. Lots of different examples of different forms of cultural oppression, the outlining of our potlatches, of different practices, you know, the systematic erasure and oppression, and just, I mean, really straight out outlying a lot of those things has been hugely impactful for our communities. And, you know, you're seeing a lot of efforts now to revitalize our languages, revitalize some of our songs and all of those things. And that's directly tied to many years of oppression and systematic oppression. We also have mixed economies now. So we both have a subsistence economy. We also have a cash economy. And you see how many remote regions are, you know, really trying to figure out what are some economic development opportunities that both honor the subsistence economy, but that also allow people to have wages to be able to pay for things that are really important to our lives. We also, as I mentioned, have kind of fractured land ownership patterns. We also find ourselves, I think, in a post-colonial world where we have restricted access to subsistence resources. As mentioned before, our people were stewards, ancestral stewards of our resources, and would only take as much as we need, and always preserved some of that share for future generations. But now some of those systems are not being regulated by our people, and it's really created a lot of hardship and a lack of sustainable management. We also have layered forms of government. Most tribal government, their tribal communities had their own traditional systems of governance. And now what we're starting to see is this evolution of a lot more layers. So we have, of course, the federal government, we have the state government, we also have borough governments, we have city governments, we have tribal governments. Like there's just all these kind of new layers. And so nobody operates sort of in a silo, right? And that really matters. It matters to how our communities function and the powers that we sort of have and how we interact with other governments around us. Which also brings me to the next point, that Alaska tribes, we have about 229 federally recognized tribes in the state, and they've been federally recognized since the 90s. But it has been very difficult to have the state of Alaska actually recognize our tribal sovereignty. And it wasn't only until very recently that actually was a thing. And so our contested tribal sovereignty is a really big deal, because if you think about the number of tribes, just the sheer number of tribes in the lower 48, which is like 540 something, I think, 40% of all federally recognized tribes exist within the state of Alaska. That there's no other state that even comes close to that. So that's a really big deal when we think about, how tribes are engaging in community development into the future and what that means for the state. The next point is just that with some of the modernization and the new infrastructure that has come with the settlement of permanent communities, we have seen a much higher dependency on external funding. That's not just true for villages, that's true for, I think, Alaska in general. We depend a lot on external funding through grants and all kinds of pots of federal and state funding. And that really has ramifications, because sustainability is something we talk about a lot. Resiliency is something that we talk about a lot, but it's really challenged when we have high dependency and not kind of more diverse sort of options before us. And then the last one is the one we're going to focus much more on for the rest of the presentation, which is mainstream education. And there's a whole history out there of how education was introduced to our state, Western education, and how it was really deployed in our communities. And there's a lot to be said for that, but just know that the mainstream education system that we currently have today is absolutely an outgrowth of colonization as well. We can change slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the veil, and actually the veil is a concept that I heard one of my students and one of my former students and one of my good friends, Ayu Kashatek, talk about in one of my classes. And she talked about how, the mainstream public education system really kind of promotes these dominant narratives, right? And so they normalize them to the point where we don't even realize that we're starting to see the world through this kind of veil that absolutely is socially constructed. And so I included some terms up here that I thought were kind of helpful for us to think about this. So dominant narratives are really stories that project powerful messages about the inferiority of some groups and the superiority of other groups, right? So it's kind of like this theme within curriculum or understandings of history that really project a certain superiority, and it's very purposeful, right? And so I thought that this picture, which was taken just off the internet in somebody's presentation, it says white privilege is your history being part of the core curriculum and mine being taught as an elective. So that's part of this veil. That's part of what we're talking about. And I think for community development specifically, where that becomes such an issue is that we are also taught in this kind of superiority and subordinate kind of a model that people really are at fault for their poverty, and people who are from marginalized and disempowered communities, that there's something about them that really is wrong, and that is why they're in the situation that they're in. And therefore we pathologize them, right? We literally just, it's an easy way to just disregard them and the concerns that they have, and the situations that they're in, or the experiences that they've had. And then it becomes, our attention takes away from the system, and it's on that individual and what they're doing and not doing. So that's a big issue in community development. We can go ahead and advance slides. So I was raised here in Fairbanks. I spent my summers back home in my community, but I went through the public education system here in Fairbanks. And the language that I feel like I wasn't taught are some of these terms that are represented here. And I'm not going to go through all of them per se, but what I wanted to share is that in those 12 years of going through the public education system at multiple schools, I never once had an Alaska Native teacher in the classroom. I had lots of elders, I had lots of, my own mother and other figures that were really important to my education, but I never once had one in the classroom. And I never once was introduced to an alternative version of history, an alternative understanding of political science, an alternative understanding and worldview of math. And so this is how some of this, these systems work in tandem, and that veil continues to this day. How without making room for those other ways of understanding, without making room for diverse educators, you really are narrowing. When I talked in that description about expanding or narrowing your awareness, right now, I believe, and we're in a different place. I went to high school over 20 years ago. We are, I think, getting to a different place, but the system itself is still often perpetuating these kinds of ideologies, and it's really difficult unless you're given a critical lens to see this for what it is, right? And so I just wanted to share this, and we can go to the next slide. So I graduated. This is my parents. My dad, who came from California originally, came to Alaska as a Vista volunteer. My mom, who's originally from here, born and raised, was born in a canvas tent in the Arctic Village area in the 1930s in the middle of winter. And you can see my little niece here, who's like photobombing. But this was my high school graduation. And so I was looking at this picture yesterday thinking, wow, what she didn't know, right? What she wasn't taught. And so at that point, I decided to leave Alaska and go to college elsewhere. So we can advance slide. And this is really where, in my own personal experience, the lifting of the veil started happening. And it's kind of like an awakening, I guess, for lack of a better word. Can advance slide. So where I ended up is at Western Washington University, and they have a small college within Western called Fairhaven. And Fairhaven, I pulled some language from their website because I was like, I don't know how I would even describe Fairhaven, but they are committed to transformative, creative, inquiry-based learning that really empowers students to pursue social, economic, and environmental justice. They're committed and they nurture all kinds of educational programs that really include that social justice kind of mindset. And really the thing I took away most from Fairhaven was the critical thinking skills. They had us apply a critical lens to everything that we were learning. And for the very first time, I took an African-American history course. I took an American Indian history course. I took an Asian American history course. They had courses on LGBTQ. And all of a sudden I started realizing, wow, there's all these kind of counter narratives out there that I had no idea existed. And this is a picture of me and my friend out in on the Makah Reservation, because our classes would literally go out into communities and we would learn firsthand about, for example, the Makah and their fight and struggle to reinsert their treaty rights to hunt whales after 60 years. So, it's that applied education where we were really on the ground with communities and learning about what their needs were. So we can go ahead and advance slides. It was during this time that I started to get introduced to critical theory. And of course, one of the architects behind critical theory is Paulo Freire. And he was a Brazilian philosopher and educator. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about his work, which has, there's been all kinds of outgrowth from it, is that it actually looks at the traditional view of education and why that becomes problematic. And thinking about an alternative in problem posing education, which really helps students to develop a critical consciousness. And so from that sort of dichotomy of approaches, we get critical pedagogy. And critical pedagogy is a form of popular education that's really based on people's life experience. It begins by simply questioning everyday's life taken for grantedness to see the contradictions that we live by more clearly in order to act for change. So this is part of that deconstruction of the veil. And critical pedagogy really has to be part of a classroom, of an approach, at least, in terms of kind of understanding and alternative views, alternative worldviews in a classroom. So we can go ahead and advance slides. So there's a lot of research out there, and I'm not going to go into a lot of it for the purposes here, but basically there are these stages of awareness. There are these stages of kind of enlightenment when it comes to developing a critical consciousness. And at the individual level, critical consciousness is kind of a level of insight at which people start to recognize oppression as a structural problem rather than an individual failing. So the alternative is that kind of pathologizing, right? That it's really individuals that are failing, and that's why, they're in the positions that they're in and blah, blah, blah. This is really about taking attention away from that and looking at the structure itself. And then as we develop that as individuals, then we can kind of engage in a process of critical consciousness that extends to other people and that empowers them to start questioning their everyday life in order to recognize oppression as really a political injustice rather than as a personal failing. So I feel like, at least in my experience, that this process for me did not happen until college. And if it wasn't for that, I would still be operating probably with that veil. So we can go ahead and switch to the next slide. So as I started to move into my current field, which is community development, I really sort of ran into the same problem that a lot of the text, a lot of the information that I was absorbing through classes and programs really focused on, the evolution of community development from a Western lens, from a city building kind of perspective. And there was a book that was published, and you'll see me kind of refer to it a lot here. It's by Margaret Ledwith, was written in 2016, and it's called Community Development and Action. And basically what she did was apply Paulo Freire's critical theory to community development. So one quote says, community development has for many years suffered from a dislocation of its theory from its practice. This results in us not only making it up as we go, but we put ourselves in danger of acting to support a status quo that continues to churn out the same inequalities with the same results. So in other words, if we don't have this heightened awareness, we are going to become complicit in the system and really just perpetuate the outcomes that the system produces. And a lot of times those outcomes are not benefiting our communities. We can go to the next slide. So she also offers a helpful framework that there really is two sort of ends of a spectrum, two different types of practice as community development practitioners. And when I say practitioners, people might be like, I'm not in community development. If you have anything to do with community, then you're part of the community development process, right? Like whether you're a parent, whether you're an educator, whether you're in tribal administration, you have a role to play in your community's development. And so we all absolutely have a connection to this. And so what this visual is meant to do is to sort of compare our approach. So one of the approaches is really just trying to make things better on the surface. And you can see a picture of a iceberg here. that all we're trying to do is just make life a little better for people in our communities that are experiencing hardship or discrimination or whatever. So that's our main focus. But we also have to realize that with an iceberg, there's so much more under the surface, right? And so if we want to penetrate some of the root causes of some of these experiences that we're having, then we really have to have more of a transformative agenda. We really have to start to look at the root causes of discrimination, injustice, and all these sorts of things that kind of perpetuate this the position our society's in at the moment, right? And so I mentioned this because I think it's really important to think about for all of us, regardless of what position you find yourself in, of where you currently live, that we all, as we connect in with community and often want better for our communities, then we have to sort of think about these things. Where are we going to focus our time, our energy, our resources, our efforts? And so I think this is more of a spectrum than an either or, because I think, most of us probably fit somewhere along a spectrum of this. But it's important to sort of self-identify, where are you at? And I will say that there's a lot of room for people who are just trying to make things a little better around the edges, because, Lord knows we need that also. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think it takes a conscious commitment to having a more transformative agenda. So we can switch to the next slide. So when we think about how community development has often evolved in our communities, especially tribal communities, marginalized communities, communities of color, a lot of times it was an outside intervention, outside experts, outside government coming in and saying, there's problems here. We have the answers, we have some solutions, and we're going to try them. But oftentimes that recipe just ends up in short-term or band-aid solutions. So things might get a little better for a little while, but they're not long-term sustainable solutions, right? And so what we see then as this process unfolds is we see them, whoever it is, come in, do a needs assessment. We start to focus on the problems itself. We start to look outside for answers. And then this cycle of dependency perpetuates. So this has been the traditional needs-based approach to community development, and it has not, for the most part, helped in a long-term strategy. Can move to the next slide. So this model is what I for a long time, I was like, okay, how does this play out? Because I've done community development now for many years, and I was like, okay, I was trying to imagine, how does it play out when we operate from a needs-based perspective? Number one, we recognize, we have a problem. We have a problem in our community. We're not happy about it. So somebody needs to do something. Might not be us. Somebody needs to do something. Who can help us, right? It's one of the first questions we ask. What do we need funding for? What kind of grants are out there? And as we start to go down that pathway, what we find ourselves doing is our strategies become dictated by funding. What's available? What can we apply for? And then we start to implement initiatives or strategies or interventions, whatever you want to call them, based on what funding was available. And then what happens is that we may see some results and we may not. It's not setting us up necessarily for really thoughtful interventions and strategies. We can move to the next slide. As we go through that process, it's also compounded by the fact that we have sort of an arena that community development happens in. We have these politics that get layered on top of it. And what often happens is our communities, they express local concerns. They really have challenges that are confronting them. But pretty soon we start to say, okay, well, what can we do about those? And they become very driven by what's possible, what funding exists, our human capacity, and all these things. And for infrastructure related projects in particular, you start to go down this funnel, and all of these different variables that are really imposed kind of from the outside start to narrow the field of possible solutions, right? And pretty soon, as you kind of go through that funnel, you really end up with maybe like a tangible project or a program, and you start to lose that sort of holistic sense of how can we respond to this challenge? What are the multiple strategies that we can deploy that could help us to get to where we want to go, rather than having just kind of like a building or a program to show for it at the end of the day. And this is just how the politics of community development have really evolved. And I think that communities really often struggle with this, because especially rural and tribal communities, we tend to be very holistic thinkers. And when our field of solutions starts to get narrowed just by virtue of these processes, it kind of, it affects our overall success of our solutions. We can go to the next slide. So this is a graphic that I often use in my classes when I try to teach why it's important to take a step back. Like, let's take a step back from just kind of focusing on our problems and our challenges all the time. We need to better understand and frame what the central problems or challenges are, and then what are the symptoms of those challenges and what are the root causes. And so this is a problem tree. I learned this many years ago, and this was actually one done by students in the tribal governance program here at UAF. And what they were really struggling with at the time was understanding what is the central and core issues that are bringing us here together today in that particular class. And after some discussion, the consensus was, look, it's that traditional stewardship of our natural resources is being superseded by state and federal management systems. And there's kind of a lack of meaningful engagement or co-management of a lot of those resources. And so then as we started to get clarity around what the central issue was, then we asked, well, how does that manifest itself in our communities? Like if this is the situation we find ourselves in, how do we experience that on the ground? And so you can see all those branches up here, we see a decline in our overall resources. And we're seeing that now on the Yukon with our salmon. We see infighting between different stakeholder groups. We see stricter regulations. We see declining health outcomes directly, our people. We see substance abuse sometimes. We see financial strain. We see greater instances of food insecurity. Like, all of these things are some of the issues that are so pronounced on the ground in our communities. But when we take a step back and we say, well, and this is very classic of community development, that the politics and the way it's set up are that we spend all our time and attention on just trying to alleviate those symptoms, right? Programs, grant funds, it's all saying we can improve these indicators. We can do more to reverse substance abuse. We can do more to reverse, whatever it is. But the reality is if we spend 90% of our time trying to alleviate those symptoms, we're never going to get to the place where we are actually critically looking at the root causes of why we're in this place in the first place. And if we never get to that depth, that iceberg, then what'll happen is we're just going to pass on this same dynamic, these same set of conditions to next generations, right? So I think all of us that care about communities have to be reflective of this and say, even though a lot of these symptoms are acute and our communities are, at crisis points in dealing with them, that somehow we have to keep with a perspective that looks at these root causes and to try to problem solve there also. And so you'll see this quote up here. This actually comes from my dissertation, which kind of reflects the understanding that colonization is the fundamental challenge to village self-reliance. And so you could do this problem tree for education, you could do it for, health, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, there will be these bigger themes and drivers of some of the root challenges that our communities face. We can change the next slide. So just to kind of wrap up and thread the needle a little bit. So many of you probably know Graham and Linda Smith, who are very phenomenal scholars. And a couple of years ago, Graham ended up coming to Alaska. And one of the things he talked about in our conversations was a Maori proverb. And it translates to "show me the blisters on your hands." And I really think this is like a beautiful way to talk about the investment that we have to make in this work, that none of us have the ability to kind of wash our hands of all these issues. Like, if we participate in community, if we participate into society, then we carry some of that responsibility. And so this idea is that we all have to kind of get our hands dirty in this work in some way. And if we don't have those blisters, then that's very telling of commitment, right? So I think this is a really important analogy to move into the next section. So we can go ahead and advance slide. So I wanted to provide an example here at UAF. There are lots of programs, lots of campuses doing amazing things. But when it comes to rural and community development, one of the programs that's really leading, I think, in developing a new pedagogy of teaching community development is the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development. I wanted to share their vision and mission here. Their vision is self-determined Indigenous and community development, and their mission is empowering communities through our students. And so part of changing this narrative and lifting the veil is making accessible purposefully textbooks and materials in our classrooms that really encourage that critical thinking, the kind of process that I went through at Fairhaven that other people have gone through in their own lives. But it's intentionally adding the critical consciousness development and affording a place within university classes to safely explore that. Right. And so that students, as they journey into building their awareness, they're not doing it alone. They're doing it in a supportive environment with others. And that really starts to enhance that sort of conscientiousization. We have trouble saying that, where it's not just an individual exercise of critical thinking, it extends beyond to community. So we can change the next slide. So what we teach in that program, which I was a faculty in for 7 years, is much more of an asset-based approach to community development. And so what that does is it focuses on our existing strengths of our communities. We look towards ourselves first for wisdom, for resources, and then we look externally secondary, right? Like we first try to figure out what we have that we can bring to the table, what resources that we can tap internally. And then we recognize that there's maybe a part to play for other partnerships, other funding, and those sorts of things. But really, it's our efforts are not going to begin and die with other people and what resources they have to bring to the table. And what that naturally moves us to is longer term, more sustainable solutions. And our process then really begins not necessarily from a place of need, but a desire for change. And we really encourage our own problem solving, our own community wisdom. It encourages self-reliance, and the responsibility to act falls upon ourselves, not any others. So this is a really different mindset and framework. We can change the slide. And how does it affect the process? We start not by saying, oh my gosh, there's a need, like let's pull the fire alarm. It's that we believe that better outcomes are possible and that we're deserving of better outcomes. We start to convene to discuss not what it is we don't want, because we see plenty of that. We see plenty of rates. We're in the high rate categories for all these social ills that we don't want to be in, but we actually start the conversation of what do we want to see? What strengths and assets exist internally? And then rather than kind of chasing funding, we're asking ourselves, where are our gaps in resources? And how can we partner with others to meet those resource gaps? And then we don't put all our eggs in one basket, but we start to implement things and we evaluate how are we doing, and we evaluate how it's going, and we're going to see some results and we're going to have to improve things. And then we start over, right? Like we're always going to be in this process, but it's a much more empowering process than the latter needs-based one that I shared earlier. We can go ahead and change slides. So a lot of what we do, I think at UAF, and particularly in the Dansard program, is we're about preparing the next generation of community development practitioners. And I included this quote that I want to share because I think this speaks to any of us who are interested in capacity building and interested in empowerment. It says the challenge of community development is to create the conditions for people to become confident and autonomous, able to act together to bring about change. That's really the fundamental challenge. It's not about, needing all these buildings. It's not about solving all the world's problems. It's about creating the conditions for people to become confident and autonomous and able to act together to bring about change. So then if we operate from that understanding, then as practitioners, the first step in that process is to fully believe in people's capacity to be thinking and conscious, capable of acting together to change their lives and to change the world. And the subtext of this is that without this belief, it is impossible to work towards the concept of empowerment. Like if you don't fundamentally believe that people are capable, then really it's a non-starter, right? And so you really have to kind of challenge your own thinking and that veil, maybe the remnants of that veil, to really step outside of that construct and really kind of operate differently in practice. We can change slides. So one of the slides that I want to leave you with, and this is just to kind of get all of us thinking about where are we at in our own community development journey, in our own sort of awareness building as a collective. And what I would share, and this largely comes from my PhD work here at UAF, is that there is a spectrum of self-determination, and there's a lot of other kind of granulance of this. But really, it's about either being self-determined or externally controlled or externally driven, right? And a lot of our communities have unfortunately been positioned to really fall on the darker part of that spectrum. But now we know that there are other alternative approaches possible. And so we begin to start to self-reflect, and we start to ask ourselves questions and to be critical. And that's part of that critical consciousness. It's we ask ourselves questions like, whose future are we talking about? Community development is all about aspiring towards a different future with better outcomes. So what should this future look like? What could it look like? Who's making the decision? Who has the authority? Whose values, concepts, and knowledge is represented? How are we actually going about doing this? What frameworks are we working? And the last question is, where are Indigenous peoples positioned in the construction of that future? I think all of these have been very helpful in lifting that veil for community development in Alaska. And largely how we're doing that is through our programs at UAF that really teach these critical thinking skills, where our students can start to self-reflect on some of this stuff. Is really, really important. So we can go ahead and advance the slide. I believe that was my last slide. So I'm right at 1 o'clock, and I told Dr. Amaroq I was going to be an hour. So I want to open it up to see if we have any reflections, questions, thoughts that came out as I was presenting, and we'll just end it there and say Masi Cho.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you so much. You introduced a great deal of vocabulary and many concepts and explained them through context. So thank you. We appreciate your message to exercise radical practice so as not to be complicit in maintaining status quo. And there is a question specific to this. You've addressed it with your message to focus on strengths and goals with our work, but here's the question. Can you give some examples of long-term goals for community development in Alaska that utilize a radical practice?
Yeah, so I would say I actually have a slide that talks about some of the outcomes that I see are very common across rural Alaska. And so they are usually tied to wanting to not be disproportionately impacted by state and federal policies in a negative way. They are all about increasing equitable access to public education, to public safety, all of those real basic needs that we have as communities. They're about wanting to have continued access to our traditional lands, our ways of life, our resources. And, you know, while they may not be sort of radical in their appearance, it's the radicalness comes from sort of daring to believe that all of those things are possible. And then our strategies of how we're going to get there, right? That's really where that comes in as practitioners. It's articulating that these are the outcomes that we want for our community and being very clear and very strong about those. And then really being thoughtful of the community development process and the strategies that we're going to use to eventually get to those outcomes.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions so far. You present the term ideological persuasion. Is this the same as inculcating patriotism?
Ooh, I'm not really sure, I'm not familiar with that term, but patriotism is often referred to as one of the examples of ideological persuasion. Really, it's any kind of ideals or definitions of values within a society. So, you could say marriage, how it's constructed in a Western sense, could be part of that. Patriotism, all kinds of values, right? So, I mean, I'm not familiar with that particular terminology, but I do think it could be related.
Thank you. I think so, just from the sound of the term related to its meaning. The next question, do you think the inefficiencies of the multiple layers of government also hinder the allocation of external funding? I'm not sure if that relates to university or the community at large, but maybe you could answer both ways.
Yeah, I think it can hinder and it can help. It kind of depends on the situation. So for example, in a small community where you may have a tribal council and you may have a village corporation and you may have a city government, there are different pots of funding that are available to those various entities, right? And a lot of times, like you'll see in a community infrastructure project, a tribe will be able to apply for a certain pot of funding. And then the city, if they have the same priority, will be able to access additional funding. And if they are working together and can sort of compile some of that funding, then it can be very helpful in terms of overall fundraising. So I think in those kinds of cases, it can be helpful. I will say that it does add to the complexity, right? And when you're developing a community development plan for a community that has multiple layers of government, you need to make sure that they're all on the same page and they're all kind of part of that envisioning of the future, because otherwise there's, just by nature of kind of the different functions of those entities, that they have interests that they have to look out for. They have, budgets that they have to sort of subscribe to, and it can add to the level of complexity and problem solving.
Right, thank you. And then may we have a copy of the Alaska Land Ownership Map? Are there maps of each region?
So that's a large map. Yeah, absolutely. I could send a link out you can find it on Google. And then the map, the smaller map that I provided of Fort Yukon was really from the Doyon website. So I imagine that there is more varieties of different land management aerials and plans out there, but I think just do a little bit of research and you'd be able to find them.
Thank you. And then there were several requests for your PowerPoint, so I don't know if you'll be making that available or not.
Yes, I absolutely can.
Thank you. So there are quite a few messages of thank you in the chat. And we also want to thank you on behalf of Northwest Campus, the Nanook Diversity Center, and the Equity Office. I'm going to have to watch your presentation several more times when it becomes available, because it was so full of terms, concepts, knowledge, things that we need to all consider in our day-to-day lives, along with our professional lives. These are very important messages that you've given us, and we're grateful. You have a great deal of experience. You have a great deal to give, and as you and I both know, one of the major life principles for Alaska Native peoples, and for many people, is the intention to not serve ourselves, but to serve our communities, and do what we can to work towards social justice and equity, and the work is very much needed in today's world. And the university is, in my opinion, one of the ideal spots where it can come from. So thank you so much, Charlene, for presenting today.
You're welcome.
And I don't see any more questions, so I will say to the audience Thank you for joining us today. Please keep an eye out for upcoming Shine a Light presentations at nwc.uaf.edu or facebook.com/uaf.nwc. If you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the courses tab at nwc.uaf.edu. Thank you, Charlene, and thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much.